All right, we're now broadcasting.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am Neil Lester. I'm a professor here at Arizona State University. I also direct an initiative called Project Humanities, where we bring individuals and communities together to talk, listen, and connect. We are excited tonight to be hosting our third virtual public program tonight on what we have come to identify as call out culture. What's interesting about Project Humanities is that we've been doing this for almost 10 years, bringing people together to discuss these complicated ideas. And particularly tonight, even as we were putting this program together and deciding how to describe it, our organization was called out in how we described it. So it has caused us to look deeply and to be reflective and to also try to embody these principles that our program tries to promote and to celebrate. Principles that we've called Humanity 101. You'll notice on the slide here, those principles are compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, self-reflection. These are not faith-based, but rather faith in humanity. And one of the principles, they're not necessarily prioritized, that this program especially asks us to pay attention to is the one on self-reflection. Even as we were describing this program, this became way more nuanced than we knew when we started the idea. I do want to point out, however, that as we go through this, we do have some objectives in mind. And I hope that our program hits these objectives in one way or another that satisfies you. We hope that there'll be no technical glitches, but we ask your forgiveness if there's stuff that we have to navigate. Our objectives for tonight are these. We want to identify the spectrum of experiences and behaviors under this umbrella we call call-out culture. We also want to look at, to some extent, the cultural norms and public expectations that create, justify, and sustain what we call call-out culture. We also want to pay a little bit of attention to what we call the positive and negative, the positive benefits and the negative consequences of call-out culture. We also want to look at the value of calling out as a form of communication, but also as a cultural system of accountability. And finally, we want to contemplate forms of communication that promote accountability through these principles that we call Humanity 101. We have experts tonight, but we welcome and invite your participation as we try to gauge not only where you are, but where we sort of end up at the end of this conversation. We are not here to answer all the questions, but rather to tease out the nuances of something that is happening right before us. And with that said, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel, who will open our first activity in terms of gauging our audience attitudes about call-out culture. Thank you again for attending.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm a coordinator here with ASU Project Humanities. And we're going to open the program with a short poll that's meant to gauge our attitudes towards call-out culture. So I'm going to launch the first question right now. And that first question is, or rather that first agree-disagree is, a public figure should take accountability for transgressions that happened years or decades ago. I'm going to leave this up for about 30 seconds, and then afterwards we'll immediately share. All right, we're going to give 5 more seconds. It looks like 70% of our attendees have voted. All right, and now we're going to share those results. So as you can see, about 48% of us agree. The majority of people agree on some level, and then some of us do disagree as well. So we'll now go to the next one. Question number, or rather, Number two, there are some public figures, art or artists whose work that I refuse to consume because I disagree with their morals and or past behavior. I'm going to give 30 seconds for folks to respond to that. All right, we're going to give 5 more seconds. It looks like we've got 78% of our attendees who have voted. Let's see if we can get one more person to vote. And we did. All right, great. And as you can see, the majority of folks agreed with this, but we do have a couple more people who do somewhat disagree or disagree. But most people agree that they do not consume certain folks' work because they don't agree with their morals. All right, we'll move on to the next one. Number 3, if an artist commits or is accused of committing an act of violence, their music, or rather any work, should no longer be sold publicly or played. All right, we'll give that 5 more seconds. All right. And as you can see, this one we're a little more split on. More people seem to disagree or are neutral. And then there are some folks that somewhat agree or agree. So it is kind of split. All right, we're going to move to number 4. People should not be punished by the public if they apologize. All right, we're gonna give about 5 more seconds for that. All right. And again, this one was more split, but it does look like most people do somewhat disagree with this. All right, now we'll move to the next question. We have 2 questions left, and then we're going to move on to the content. So, call-out culture holds people accountable for their actions. All right, and people are voting pretty quickly here, so I'm just going to give it 5 more seconds. 1, 2. All right, looks like everyone's done voting. We've got 1 more vote, cool. All right. And again, this one is pretty evenly, this one is actually split. This one is actually split right down the middle. Looks like people are pretty much equal on whether they agree or disagree. We have some folks who are neutral, but nobody completely disagrees. All right. And then our very last question. Call-out culture is not effective and only serves to polarize groups. And we're voting very quickly on this one as well. I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds. 2, 1. Are we going to have 1 more person vote? Nope, looks like we're all done. All right. So what's interesting here is that not everybody actually agrees. Nobody fully agrees. We only somewhat agree or are neutral. But again, opinions are all across the board. So that's it for our polling activity. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our panelists and our experts.
Let me, Rachel, introduce our panelists.
Yeah.
we are very excited tonight to try to contextualize and define call out culture. You know, historically, one might argue that, you know, any sort of perceived wrong can be protested against, and technically that could be call out culture. What we want to focus on tonight, however, is the way in which this is a kind of interaction and communication that ultimately is about accountability and issues of social justice and other issues that people care about on some level. Our two experts tonight, our two panelists are, our first is Dr. Sarah Amira De La Garza, who is an ASU Associate Professor and a scholar in Southwest Borderlands. She is in the ASU Hugh Downs School of Human Communication, holds 2 doctorate degrees, one in speech communication, the other in spirituality. And her work reflects her interest in exploring the challenges to well-being that occur due to the ways we do and don't permit ourselves to speak in times of great urgency, both personal and collective. She teaches courses in performance studies, intercultural communication, spirituality, and decolonial indigenous methodologies. Dr. De La Garza is a supporter of Project Humanities, has been a collaborator for a number of years. So thank you very much, Dr. De La Garza, for joining us tonight. And we are really excited about your perspectives. Our other panelist is Ellie Hutchison, who is also a strong supporter of the project and a frequent collaborator with Project Humanities. Ellie is the founding director of Phi Nikera Writers Guild, brings a wealth of experience as an educator. Her Writers Guild celebrates and promotes the art of written word and storytelling. She is an arts-rooted organizer and theologian who earned degrees both in English and in special education. A recent graduate of the Public Leadership Program at United Lutheran Seminary, she investigates interfaith engagement and activism through the arts and humanities. She has spent 10 years as a teaching artist and poet throughout the Philadelphia School District and working with Native American youth in Arizona and youth diagnosed with special needs. Ellie is very much committed to building bridges with communities through the lens of womanist liberation and Black theology, and is currently seeking ordination through the United Church of Christ. So we thank you both for joining us tonight and offering your perspective. I'll start by seeing if either or both of you want to comment on the results that we just saw in the polling.
This is me, Amira De La Garza. I think I can bring myself here to speak with you all. I think that that it was a good thing to be able to see the responses to those questions, because I think it shows that that the way that we respond to the topic is also indicative of the reason that we tend to call out. It's because we don't all agree on what we say, what we believe, what we hear. And the only way to understand how we are responding is to have conversations. So I'm really excited about the possibilities of this particular program to do just that.
And this is Ellie here, and I would just like to say, I think Dr. Lester, you and your staff laying out those objectives beforehand was really fantastic, because I think that the survey results really demonstrate the spectrum of experience, and I'm really, really excited to engage in conversation this evening. And thank you for that 15-year younger picture of myself. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Same here.
Right. Well, we're not going to the area of ageism now. I do want to say that we of the staff have learned so much over the course of the past few weeks. And as I said, just this weekend, we were called out for our description of this particular event. And the call out challenged us to go back to that description to see if it matched what we say our objectives match. So we thank for the call out, and it caused us to sort of make changes. And that is certainly one way that calling out can take place. I've introduced our panelists, and I want to now have an engagement piece with our participants. We're going to call this the Think and Share. And we first want, okay, yeah, the Think and Share. We want you to take a few minutes to think about this question, and then we will have our two guest panelists respond as we see your responses show up in the chat box, okay? So recall a time when you were called out by someone or for something. How did it make you feel, and what motivated, or I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Recall a time when you called someone out for something. How did it make you feel, and what motivated the call out? So recall a time when you called out someone or something. How did it make you feel, and what motivated your call out? So if we could see some responses there. And this presumes that everybody has been called out or has called out someone. So recall a time when you called out someone or something, and how did it make you feel by calling someone out? What motivated the call out? Dr. De La Garza and Ellie, are you seeing some of the responses?
Yes, we are.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Feel free to chime in as people are responding.
Well, I'm reading these initial ones that are coming out, and one of the things that I recognize is the fact that usually when we've heard something or witnessed something that makes us call out, what I'm noticing in some of these responses is the fact that it arouses our emotions in some way, or creates a sense of having to make a decision about whether we're going to say or do something. And so we become self-conscious because we're about to put the attention on ourselves as we say something. So I think it's important to know how powerful situations can be to make us feel that we need to respond.
Mm.
And then to feel like we're going to be in the public eye some way or another.
Okay. Ellie, any comments on any of the comments?
I'm still thoughtfully reading through them.
Okay, yeah. This is a time when you called out someone. I see issues about privilege over there, calling out a group of colleagues on their privilege, motivated by their own experiences, as well as wanting to be an advocate for others. Made me feel self-conscious, was motivated by an understanding that these small acts can lead to larger causes or instances of violence. Okay, all right.
Dr.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellie. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry about that. I really, there's one that speaks to the quote unquote undeserved hero worship of Kobe Bryant. And I think that's interesting, definitely a very interesting topic when we think of how do we choose to remember people after they've left us, right? And yeah, I'm really intrigued with that.
Yes. Well, and some of us remember when that happened, that there was this sort of glorification. And then I saw someone else who said, well, what about the victim of the sexual assault? And then that person got called out for calling it out. So there tends to be this sort of cycle of calling out and being called out. Now let's think about this other side of this. Recall a time when you were called out by someone for something. How did it make you feel? And did your thinking, actions, words change as a result of being called out? So once again, before we talked about calling someone else out, now we're asking you to think about and share with us a time that you were called out by someone. How did it make you feel? And did your thinking, actions, words change as a result of being called out? I'll give you a few minutes to chat with us. Rachel, can we see the chat box, please? On the side. Thank you.
One of the things that I noticed right there is one of the participants is saying how at the moment they kind of felt embarrassed, but then later grateful. And I think one of the things about being called out is that it tends to often have a surprise element. And in general, human beings are not expecting to be called out. The way that conversation and human interaction happens, our expectations are not to be called out on what we're saying. So if somebody does call us out, we are surprised and we tend to feel some dissonance. And being on the spot, whatever reaction we get at that particular time, which is usually what we tend to see in the news and the media, in some of these public calling outs, is not necessarily what the person might actually consider about what they've said if they've been given the time to reflect upon it. But we don't tend to give people a time to reflect upon it when we call them out in the situation where it happens. And often, we tend to live in a really fast-paced, hyper-mediated world. So I think it's important to recognize that that a lot of times when people respond immediately, whether it's ourselves or someone that we've called out, that might not necessarily be the full response. I just think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Okay. Any other responses to the responses?
Yeah, I really, I'm really intrigued by the fact that how many times that when we participate in thinking in allyship or any of that work, how much we actually participate in a system of oppression and what that looks like. And so, yeah, I'm with a lot of these. I see that there's social, the Facebook, this is the first time that I've seen anybody comment on using social media, which is where I know a lot of the call out culture can happen. But I'm at least from what the chat appears that most folks are doing this in person or having it face to face. So I'm really curious about how those ended up working out. But yeah, it's hard to think about call out culture. And when you think you're doing the right thing, I often say, even with the best intentions, sometimes we mess up. And I think that a really important notification on the chat.
Yeah, and we don't tend to call people out on things that we have lukewarm feelings about. We tend to call out people about things that we have a really strong commitment to or belief, or we are allies. We're standing up for people that we care about or causes that we care about. So, so I think we're wanting to be heard. We're wanting there to be an impact, and I guess that the piece for me that I think is really important is how an actual relationship or dialogue can happen between the participants, or whether or not as a call out culture, we are creating a form of communication that merely disrupts and censors and stops without any opportunity for dialogue. I think the most important thing is, for me, in terms of my commitment to communication, is that I am not only going to communicate with people I consider my allies and friends. I would consider that my life is successful if I can communicate with people that I don't agree with, and that I can have relationships and find that place of humanity, even with the people that I really don't agree with. And so, so what fascinates me is whether or not people actually increase their capacity to do that, or whether they just reinforce their belief that they're right.
So calling out is asking for dialogue?
Well, I think it offers the opportunity for it.
Okay.
I don't know that it's asking for it.
Okay.
But I think, but given that it's the beginning of it's taking a turn in interaction.
Right.
It's violating the rules of interaction if it doesn't want the response.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting to me. I'm just looking at the detail in the second part of recall the time we were called out.
Yes, yes.
And it reminds me of an exercise about think of a time, someone that has done a lot of good things for you. Talk about that for 10 minutes. Think about someone who's done a really, really good things for you, and people talk for 2 minutes or 1 minute, and they came up with a list. When it came to thinking of someone who has done something really, harmful to you, that became a dramatization almost, a way of kind of recreating that. And I wonder if that's playing out in even the question of remembering when one was called out versus what I've seen when we talked about calling somebody else out. Do you see any patterns in that potentially, the level of detail or what we're remembering or choosing to remember?
I think so.
Yeah.
Ellie.
Go ahead, Ellie. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I think it's the performative action that might go along with the call out. I've had experiences, or I've been in moments where this has happened, and not that it was my right to gauge somebody's reason beyond the reason of calling out, but there did tend to be a performative action behind it. So I think that might go into that nuanced detail.
Right.
I also think that when we're called out, and some of the people here have responded that they kind of felt scolded, or they felt they were embarrassed because they felt they were told they'd been done something wrong. It's a negative experience. It feels harsh. You've been interrupted in your normal way of being, and so it has depending on the nature of the call out, it has a somewhat, it can be a somewhat traumatic, or at least have some elements of unresolved negative interaction. And I think that is the reason that when we recount them, we relive them, because that is the way that human beings make sense of negative experiences. We tend to relive it until we've been able to process it. So it doesn't surprise me that when we remember something that was not positive for us, that we tell the story again, we recount it, we dramatize it,
Mhm.
right? And it's the reason that a lot of social action pedagogies and efforts of Freire, Boal, these approaches actually have people reenact things that have happened in order to be able to comprehend what it was happening. Because if it surprised us, we tend to just keep replaying it as it happened, and until we can actually understand it, it doesn't really become part of how we live. We just keep reacting to it.
Hmm.
Uh,
Well, it's interesting, as I said, that we were called out in the process of doing this, but that's not the first time we've been called out. And it's interesting how an organization responds to that, and we'll get to that later in the program. Yeah. But the personal becomes professional, it becomes political, and all those things get wrapped up in the call out. And in the cases where we were called out, we were legitimately called out for stuff that we had noticed. And it left us with trying to sort of explain and justify, but ultimately trying to be more aware of how not to be called out, and trying not to be called out is a near impossibility. So we were mindful of the call out and tried to be responsive to that. How helpful is it, as we keep talking about call out culture, but we don't even necessarily have a real absolute concrete definition of what constitutes call out culture. So what is call out culture? You know, we've gone to Wikipedia, we've gone to other activists to try to figure out exactly what it is, and we couldn't quite come up with anything that actually made us feel comfortable. So I can give you a sense of one of those attempts. One of those attempts, and I want to undermine the idea of attempts, and then we'll get our two panelists to respond to that. One attempt says call out culture, also referred to as outrage culture, is a form of public humiliation that aims to hold individuals and groups accountable for their actions by calling attention to behavior that is perceived to be problematic, usually on social media. So perhaps you'll start us, Dr. De La Garza, with talking about the need to, well, let's look at this attempt first, and then we'll talk about the need for a definition. Any comments on attempt number one? And I know Wikipedia isn't the most scholarly source, but we know it's often from crowdsourcing, so we can grab some morsels of how people think and feel about it. Any thoughts on that particular attempt?
Well, I think it captures the emotional aspect of it by focusing on the notion of it as being a form of humiliation. And I don't know that all people would always be trying to humiliate when they do this. But I think it's definitely a public a call for accountability is maybe what, and I see that where it says that it's aims to hold individuals and groups accountable for their actions, but I don't know that it always is a form of humiliation.
Okay. And often that's interchanged with shaming, like public shaming or public humiliation. Ellie, any comments about that definition?
Actually, I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay, so what, and it's interesting that those operative words, perceived to be problematic, and the public humiliation and the shaming. Let's go to the second attempt, and then we'll talk about why we need a definition. And maybe the definition for us will come in the doing and the examples and the conversation, rather than trying to define it as one thing, but recognizing it as a spectrum of things. Our second attempt comes from Sean Scott, who says it's a catch-all phrase that refers to extremely online, and this is exact wording, practice of denouncing racist, sexist, or otherwise problematic statements on the internet itself.
I personally think that I have an issue with this. I mean, in our contemporary sense or knowledge, I believe that, yes, it is, we understand that it's an online phenomenon, but in reality, call-outness or call-out culture has existed far beyond this. This is just now providing a platform for a lot of communities that may not have had a platform to be able to express themselves in a way. So I'm a little iffy about that one.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's interesting you said platform, because that's, you know, that's one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about is, in one way or another, people have always been protesting something that is perceived as a wrong.
Right.
And, you know, that's potentially a calling out, but this kind of interaction that we're talking about now, you know, is often dismissed as political correctness. Oh, you're just being PC. Or, you know, and some are feeling that even with being politically correct, you're sort of shutting people down and silencing them. Do you want to address that a little bit, Dr. De La Garza, the silencing, the shutting down?
Well, I think that's what I'm addressing when I'm talking about the fact that the opportunity to have interaction oftentimes isn't taken. But I also think that I want to mention, I want to follow up on something that Ellie said, which has to do with the fact that because of the online platforms and the social media presence now of many voices and many collective efforts that have typically been allowed to remain marginalized and publicly marginalized, because if you weren't part of them, you never ever had to see or hear what those groups were doing. Now, because of the internet, these voices are present online, and because of the fact that we have the internet, we also have the kinds of messages and efforts that many of these groups wish to call out. And so we're now able to see the kinds of things that were able to be kept secret and private and out of the public eye if inappropriate and prejudicial, harmful things were being said and done, and people were being called out privately or in person. There was no public learning potential from that because of the fact that because it was private. Now that it's online, I think this is the one aspect that makes me think that perhaps we are beginning to see something that is cultural, because it's beginning to set a norm that if we're expressing ourselves in public, that the calling out process allows for there to be public learning through observation, and whether or not you engage in it or not, you read it, that's a form of engagement. You can learn what is being said, how it's being responded to, how others respond to that. And I think we're being able to learn what only narrow segments of the population used to be able to have accessible in their experience before.
But does that presume a kind of I think it was termed a self-righteousness on the part of the caller that needs to be addressed, because I'm going to call you for something that you're doing wrong because I know that how I think is right and you should believe that?
Yes. Yeah, I think it does, which is why, and as you all know, when we were preparing for this, that a big part of my perspective on this, and I am known as someone who calls out. I am invited to meetings because people know that I will call out when others won't. Mm-hmm. And people will tell me, I'm sorry you didn't show up because we really needed you there. because other people won't do it. So I think it's really surprising sometimes to people to hear that my opinions and feelings of this are very much about compassion and being able to put myself in the shoes, even of the people that I cannot stand what they said, because I am not calling out a monolith. I'm not calling out an object. I'm calling out a human being that may have said and done something that I found abhorrent, but that I cannot, in my own mind, dismiss that there is a potential in that human being to come to a place of understanding and growth and learning. And so if I'm going to call someone out, I need to, in my mind, this is the way I approach it. I try to figure out where were they coming from? And so a lot of times when I call out, I start by asking a question rather than telling them what they just did. And by asking the question, I provide an opportunity for some reflection or for some clarification that can help. It simultaneously allows the individual maybe to self-correct, but it also gives me an opportunity to maybe better understand what they were trying to say or do. And then to be able to say, well, here's what I heard you say, and because of the fact that I work with such and such a group of people, or because of the fact that I grew up in such and such a way, or whatever it is, I provide a context. I found that really problematic, or I found it hurtful, or I found it inappropriate, and then I explain why. So there's like the components, like first, I'm gonna ask you to give me a little bit more context about what you just said, and then I'm going to tell you why it is something I need to address, and I'm going to tell you specifically whether I found it inappropriate, hurtful, harmful, or maybe all of those things, and then I'm going to tell you why I found it that way. So in that way, it's much different than my saying, I don't like what you just said, that was totally inappropriate, and that can't be done anymore. That I find usually doesn't lead and that will lead to some silencing. It might lead to some correcting in behavior, but I don't know that it leads to any change in human beings.
Well, that's a lot of emotional labor for those who are doing the call out, though. And I wonder the extent to which it places, the calling out puts a lot of responsibility, if you look at that as the end of what is to be achieved, though. When somebody has called out, not only has that person who's doing the calling out kind of experienced something that leads to the call out, but then why would the person doing the calling out then be responsible for teaching why that call out was problematic, or that perceived call out?
I think everybody has the right to decide whether or not they want to do that, but I am a teacher. And so if I choose not to teach, I'm a hypocrite.
Mm-hmm. Well, but I'm looking at this.
I'm talking for myself. I'm speaking for myself. Right. On the other hand, I do think it provides, I'm not saying that everybody has to do what I do.
Right. I'm looking at this relative to kind of a gendered, potentially minoritized groups of folks who are always doing the call out. And I wonder if maybe what I'm getting at maybe has to do with allyship, Ellie, and the extent to which if someone, and I'm looking at this panel now, and I'm wondering if there's some gendered way that this culture is, or some way that the culture is also gendered. I don't know. That's a question I just came up with. It's not even anything that we've talked about. But I'm wondering if what does that do in terms of the teaching part of that, and the ways in which it becomes your responsibility to tell somebody why what they said or did was problematic. That can be exhausting.
Right. This is something I struggle with a lot. I had a number of years ago a moment that I had passed off a sort of a reach out, a very gentle reach out from a colleague and a dear friend of mine. And I bypassed it, and then it kind of snowballed into something to where it was a cancel culture. I know one of our attendees was talking about cancel versus call out culture. And for me, it's something, and that I think that happened in 2016, 2017, and I think about it every single day. And I've talked about it to a lot of other friends, a lot of other colleagues to ask for advice. And I've also had discussions with my therapist. And then in kind of going along with the allyship, what it helped prepare me for was to be more silent, to be somebody who listens. I think somebody who's aspiring to be a pastor or a public theologian, that I needed to listen more anyway. And where my heart is broken because of a dear friendship was lost, I have, I think, made an attempt for sure to be a better ally in different groups. That being said, a lot of the work that I've been doing in the last 2 to 3 years has really been, having conversations with white folks and how we can better improve what being an ally could look like in this regard. And I have found myself in that space to where now I had to be the person. Like my therapist will say, Ellie, you were always going to be the person who calls the emperor out for wearing new clothes. Well, that was harmful to me. It wasn't harmful, she was right, but I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to carry that load all the time. But I also understood that that was my role in those spaces. And I had something happen in December with a former employer of mine. And when I didn't say anything, apparently my face said some things. I didn't say anything at all. They were like, well, what, Ellie, you don't know about that? You know about everything that everybody does that's wrong and this and that. And I just was like, that's it. I'm done.
Everything that everybody does is wrong.
Yeah, apparently, so I balance what is, when is, how do you say it? I mean, there's so many different things. It's the words, not only just the words you use, it's how you say it. It's the posture in which you are saying it. It's the tone, it's the inflection. And it's the real intent. I think I would like to believe, but I do believe in the goodness of people, even though I call some folks out. I believe that we are innately good people. I think that we all want to exist in a world where we don't fear for our lives, whether it be from gendered violence or emotional violence or physical violence, sexual violence, any of that. And so I just think for me, I always want to try harder at reaching the people, even those who I have a hard time with. And that's been something that's very difficult for me, but I can trace it back to that moment in 2016, 2017 and say that this is what I need to do better. There are too many people that mean the world to me that I don't want to lose again.
And I think for what I was just sharing about the way that I approach this, I guess one of the things that I'd like to clarify is that is largely the way that I interact when I'm doing this online. And it's the result of, I actually find it a bit of emotional labor that is far more valuable to me than the sting from the vile responses to a direct calling out online that does not bother to create some context for my comment. So when, and this is from reaction, so where I've had to go and just delete things because it got so toxic, because I said something and then all the reactions to what I said, because it wasn't an interaction, it was just a calling out, led me to the place where I'll say, what did you mean when you said that? And then if I get a response, and sometimes it'll be something really snarky like, didn't you read what I said? Or exactly what I said. But what it does is it says, well, because when I read it, this is what I thought. And this is what I have a problem with it because of this. And then I found that when I do this, there isn't nearly the amount of trolling and abusive responses to my comments. And so I see it as a form of self-care for myself to engage in that kind of behavior, because it allows my message to be stronger and to stand there. And where I've actually, I've made allies in this way. You know, there's people that I've met on Facebook because of calling out interactions where years later we're engaged in projects together and working on projects together, as opposed to me lying in bed stinging from the trolls.
Okay. So let me see if I can summarize then some of the characteristics, and then we'll move on to some specific examples to see how our participants might respond to these particular examples. So I think what I'm hearing is that that the behavior that we identify as call out culture falls on a spectrum, and we're being asked to sort of self-examine the why behind the calling out, and to be more reflective of why and when we were called out. And the fact that this culture is new in the sense that the intensity of it has taken place online. And so we're still trying to sort of navigate what that means, calling people out that we know versus calling out perfect strangers. So here are 3 examples that we've come up with that we want your response to. And I know people were asking about positive and negative examples of call out culture. Here's one that is people may remember. In 2018, actor and comedian Kevin Hart was called out. And some of you may remember that, but for those who don't, he was called out for homophobic tweets from 2011 after being selected to host the 2019 Oscars. Hart is given the choice of publicly apologizing or stepping down. He ultimately does both. And in the following weeks, the comedian and daytime talk show host Ellen DeGeneres interviewed Hart and asked him to reconsider the hosting gig. DeGeneres was then criticized for advocating for Hart. Hart readdressed the issue in December 2019, saying, "I missed an opportunity to say simply that I don't condone any type of violence in any way, shape, form to anyone for being who they are. I messed up. Instead, I said I addressed it. I said I apologize. I said I talked about it already. I was just immature." So
I know I said when we were talking about this prior,
yes.
Yeah, I'll talk about this one.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure that what I have to say will upset some people.
Okay. And then you'll be called out?
And then I'll be called out.
Okay.
But I probably will, anyway.
Okay.
For me, this was a really interesting time frame. I think that is one of the many things that we could call Kevin Hart out for in some of his work. And for me, you know, like my son is a huge Kevin Hart fan. We've bonded over, you know, sharing and remembering jokes, and there's somebody who's brought so much happiness into people's lives for a long time in general, right? Speaking in general. And I think being a comedian and being a musician and an artist and all of that in the public setting is a very hard thing to do. I absolutely think that what he said, or the way in which he behaved once he was called out for it, was incorrect. Mm-hmm. But I also feel that his way in which to think about it in a deeper way is a really important way for, I think, celebrities and other people who have the platform to be on Ellen DeGeneres' show or whatever. I think it's an important thing for them to model after what Kevin Hart has done. It just at least thinking about, yeah, I responded this way and so on and so forth. And here's the part that I know will already upset some people. I know that Dave Chappelle is a highly complicated individual for a lot of people, but there is something about the way in which he speaks truth to so many things. And, you know, he talks about it, I think, in his series, Sticks and Stones, where he talked about, you know, like Kevin Hart doesn't have a harsh bone in his body, somebody who knows him personally, so on and so forth. So like here was somebody who was reaching out and saying, sure, he did something wrong, but does it match, does the punishment or does the retribution match the crime? You know, and I use crime in those air quotes. I'm very hesitant in when we talk about these types of things, because I do so much work, or I've done so much work around incarceration and reentry stuff. And I look at the men and women that I've worked with and the resilience that there is when they re-enter society to say things such as, I don't want to be remembered for the worst moment of my life. And if we continue in a call out culture, I think that ends up becoming a canceling culture, where I understand it's important. I think we have to balance that with how we also view incarceration, and sin and salvation and forgiveness models and stuff like that. So that's the part that I was pretty sure was going to upset some people, that I both, you know, I admire Kevin Hart for being able to come forward and make, you know, an attempt at some amends. And then I support Dave Chappelle in helping Kevin Hart do that.
And you're right, he's been called out for other stuff too, like some of that minstrel acting he does, which perpetuates stereotypes. This does move us into that section though, when we talk about celebrities, about cancel culture. Did Dr. De La Garza, did you want to add anything about the difference between, you know, canceling and what actually does that mean? How do you cancel somebody? How do you cancel a career?
I think just from, this is not my, I mean, it's not like I've done a study on what happens when cancel culture is operating, but from my observations, canceling seems to be a really rapid dynamic that seems to happen when the reaction to a calling out is very quick and automatic, and it seems in many instances, whether we're talking about Al Franken, not Al Franken, but you know, the that situation, or we're talking about individuals who have marketed certain things, whatever it is, that within a matter of days, everything shuts down and they're no longer allowed to do what they used to do because of whatever it was that happened. I think that when that happens, this is just my opinion, but I feel like it's a magnified version of what happens if you make a really stupid mistake at work that screws up an opportunity to get a job or to do something, and you're not given a second chance. If you interview and say something horribly racist and you don't get the job, they don't call you back to see if you want to change your mind and adjust what you've said. I think that when your life is lived on the public domain, that you have a higher level of accountability for what you're saying, to realize that there could be these costs for what you've done. And because we are calling people out and we are developing this sort of culture, that the likelihood for that to happen is quite high. I also think that the example, like with Kevin Hart here, is a really good example of the kind of thing that I mentioned at the very beginning when I was looking at the examples, is that when people respond immediately, it's not always exactly what they might say later after they've thought about it. And I don't know that we, whether it's the industry of news and advertising and the news cycles, or whether it's our own attention spans, I don't know that we allow for these conversations to be expanded, and whether or not we say, I'm on this side, I'm on that side, or whether we actually try to foster more of an interaction, which is why in that particular situation, I think Ellen DeGeneres does this quite often, where she tries to bring these difficult conversations onto a head, and she herself has been called out
Right.
for doing a lot of these kinds of things.
Right.
But I think that's a sign of the fact that we're very impulsive as communicators oftentimes, and it's unusual to have individuals who are willing to have the difficult conversations that don't have an easy yes or no. And that while we may champion compassion and forgiveness as values and what we say when we're in a yoga practice, I don't think that in social practice that we often see the very same values in the way in which we approach human communication. And I think that that's something that we really need to think about. I definitely try to think about it every day because of what I do. And we as human beings, you know, if we know how often we ourselves don't say what we meant to say,
Mhm.
or made a mistake in what we said,
Mhm.
then can we at least try to find the backstory behind others? And we can still make up our minds in the ways that we want to make them up. We can do whatever we feel we need to do based on something that has happened. I do that myself, but can I at least say to myself that I've tried to understand? And then once I've tried to understand, did I reach a point where I said, even trying to understand, there's just no way I can do that. I cannot support that anymore. But that's a decision, not a reaction. I'd rather be deciding my actions, not just acting impulsively.
What about the sort of performance of the apology? How important is that in the call out culture and the being held accountable and taking accountability? But how does one assess the apology as a performance?
Well, it's very subjective, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're dealing with professional performers, who's to say?
Well, but we're all professional performers on one level, though, when it comes to the performance of an apology. I mean, we hear that all the time in the criminal court system. Did the person seem like they were remorseful, or there has to be a performance of that.
And they rehearse it.
Right.
Right.
And it's not even often taken into account depending on what your gender or racial or ethnic identity.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Let's go to example number 2. That was a celebrity, because we're often doing that. But celebrity number 2, or the example number 2, some of you may have seen in 2018, a high school senior, Kezia Dom, wears a kipao. Is that how to pronounce that? A traditional Chinese garment to a prom in Utah. Online photos of Dom, a white girl, went viral, accompanied with claims of cultural appropriation. Tens of thousands of people commented on the original and shared photos. Any comment on that example? What was the purpose of the call out? And what's different about this than the example that we have with Kevin Hart? Panelists.
It's loaded. I mean, it's loaded. I'm just being reminded of someone just in the last day who got called out for cooking Mexican food. You know, people are announcing what they're cooking while they're in isolation and quarantine right now. And this white woman who had talked about the food that she was cooking and got called out for cooking Mexican food because she's not Mexican.
Oh, goodness.
And I really think that it's a really volatile area when we're talking about cultural appropriation and cultural identity, and oftentimes when these situations are are expressed, the calling out is an indicator of generational oppression. I used to work for years. I worked in the area of working with people in recovery who were dealing from generational trauma in indigenous groups and cultural trauma from colonizing and all sorts of abuse. And the
Yes.
the situation is rarely about the particular individual as much as it is about a much larger picture on both ends. What the action represents. And I remember saying one time that it's like there's a silent tide, and oftentimes the calling out on these kinds of issues when an individual does this, it's because there's like a silent tide, and it's just been building and building and building, and the expression is valid. The immensity and power of the call out is indicative of the fact that there have been power relations historically that have allowed for these kinds of things to happen with absolutely no power on the part of certain cultures and certain groups of individuals to be able to say that this shirt is it's my cultural right to wear this, you know, that my grandmother wore shirts like this, my great-grandmother wore shirts like this. Can I tell somebody else that they're appropriating my culture when they wear this? I could say that if they're doing that. When might I feel that? Probably when there's been that silent tide has been building to such an extent that it's just like one more thing that we haven't had power over.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conversations about those kinds of calling out are really, really difficult to have because they have to be much more nuanced and much more complex.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's why I think there was such a long pause after I saw that one, because it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, and that's a whole area and arena in and of itself, because there is that line that's thin for some folks that Mona has asked, how do you distinguish between appropriation and respectful appreciation? I think the issue is when the performance becomes a performance. For example, if we're talking about in blackface, I don't know how you can talk about appreciating blackface in blackface. If you're talking about dressing up as women and for the sake of funny and mocking, and I'm not talking about the art of drag, that's clearly not appreciation. So that's one of the things that particular, we don't know the result of that. We do know that people were concerned and raised issues. What I don't know, unless Jocelyn or someone else knows, is how did that person actually respond to the calling out? Okay, but clothing is certainly one of those things that people feel appropriated. I've got a shirt that I was told was actually a Mexican cultural shirt. I have it in my closet. I haven't worn it because I think about it. I don't want to be accused of appropriating when I try to go around talking about appropriation. So I don't know why I still have the shirt, but I haven't worn it. Okay, let's look at because there's another type. We can call out celebrities, we can call out individuals, but we can also call out organizations and corporations. So our example number 3 is a call out of our own institution. Some of you may remember this from 2007. 2017, ASU undergraduate Brooke Lewis was violently raped on campus by a graduate student. ASU expelled him, but an appeal board is arguing that while sexual misconduct is an egregious offense, the sanction of expulsion is too severe because, quote, he is an essential member of one of ASU's research teams. Brooke told her story on babe.net and quickly went viral. After 14,000 signatures and negative media attention, which constitutes a call out, ASU upheld the expulsion of Brooke's rapist. And we're fortunate to have the organizer of the change.org signature campaign to join us. So Jasmine, would you join us, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you, and talk a little bit about why and how one gets a campaign to address something that is egregious as this particular assault.
Okay, so I founded an organization called Sun Devils Against Sexual Assault about 7 years ago, and we've been calling out ASU for rape culture and writing petitions to get sexual predators removed from campus, and also to get policies changed to protect students. And Brooke reached out to us 3 years ago, told us about her experience, how ASU didn't want to expel her rapist despite finding that he had sexually assaulted her. And so we used our connections that we already had with journalists to get the story out and to promote the petition. And it was our most successful petition that we've ever written. I think it ended with like 25,000 signatures after it went viral, and we had a lot of different media reaching out to do stories on it. So it was an example of a successful call out, because the administration did change their position after we delivered the petition and talked to a lot of media, which doesn't always happen, but it did happen in this case.
Okay. Did the what in terms of getting all the signatures, were these people who are activists? How does one get 25,000 signatures? How is the story compelling so that people feel like that's their way of calling out and protesting?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with the Me Too movement, and a lot more people than before understanding the ways that institutions protect sexual predators. So definitely having the Me Too movement being more mainstream at that point in time really helped the petition and really helped people get behind it. And I think what also made it really successful was this was a situation where an institution was literally saying they thought sexual assault was serious, but not serious enough to warrant a serious punishment. And that's not usually something that you see a university actually put in writing. And so because this was in writing, you know, we had documentation that was proving it. It made it very compelling for people.
How long did that process take?
Well, the university changed their decision after about 14,000 signatures, but it kept growing after that because the story, I guess, was big enough. And really, I would have to attribute it to the followers that we have for Sun Devils Against Sexual Assault, like sharing it, and also attribute it to the first journalist that covered it, which was a journalist from the UK. And so I think that helped it be like a global story and not just something that was local.
Okay. Did anyone of our panelists have a question for Jasmine?
I actually do. Did the university change any policies other than expelling the student? Have they made an adjustment to any of their policies, at least to review these type of cases and the hard work that you've done?
In this specific case of the 2017 petition, no. But we had a petition in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, that was to call attention to faculty sexual misconduct at the Barrett Honors College. And we organized several student victims to file a federal complaint and to talk to the media. And after a lot of media attention, a lot of negative media attention around this, there was actually a professor who killed himself and was trying to kill his student before he did that, and that came out in the Phoenix New Times as a result of our federal complaint. And that was enough to get ASU to change policy around romantic and sexual relationships between faculty and students. So that was an example of a policy change.
Okay, thank you. We had a moment here, thank you, Jasmine. There were moments here where we had asked the question, what are some of the other examples of corporate change or corporate organizational call out that our participants have seen that want to share? Instances where organizations were called out. Do we want to have a couple of those sort of shared in our chat? What are other examples of corporations, organizations being called out? And has the call out increased accountability among corporations and organizations? So can you take a minute or two to jot down some other examples? We know that there are plenty.
While we're waiting for those, I thought I would mention something that Dr. Christine Marin mentioned on the feed a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked about the idea that, because we're focusing a lot on the calling out of undesirable or negative behaviors and expression. And she asked, is there a chance that we could also be calling out positive behaviors, positive expression? I really think that is something that that might be if we were to see positive behavior in areas where a culture of racism or sexism would typically not have that kind of behavior be explicitly exhibited, and it was not the result of a call out. I think that publicly acknowledging and calling out exemplary behavior would be something that could also be very, very powerful. But the public part of it would be important, because I don't know that that enough people have seen evidence of recognition and only see the evidence of how I will be shamed if I do the wrong thing, not how it's actually an honorable thing to respond in a proper way, so that you're modeling for others. And I think particularly in the university, I'm thinking how positive calling out, and not by awards, not by money, but by part of everyday interaction, that if we called out when behavior is positive with witnesses, not going to someone's office and saying, hey, that was a really neat thing you did, because that's just a compliment, but actually calling out in public in the same way that we're calling out these negative things could begin to demonstrate that. And if we're feeling uncomfortable about that, then I find that a really, really intriguing question, is why do we feel uncomfortable about calling out positive behavior in areas where bigotry and negative social patterns, implicit bias tend to dominate? Why would we be uncomfortable calling out positive behavior?
Dr. Lester, you're mute, just so you know.
Rachel? Okay. Just today, I sent an example to the team about call out in China because of COVID-19. And there was a sign at one of the stores saying, we don't want any Black people in our McDonald's because they have the virus. And then there was such outrage and public decrying of this that I don't know, but in a short span, they did an apology and took that sign down. So whether they changed in their hearts, one will never know, but they at least changed in terms of that policy because of the response to that. Any other examples that you want to highlight? I see something about Native Americans employing sexual predators. We know about J. Crew. Was it J. Crew that had the monkey on the little sweatshirt and said something about he's the coolest monkey in the jungle or something, which we agreed we didn't want to reproduce those images.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
am noticing, I mean, in that one response there about the many efforts when people attempt to call out institutions and organizations, and I've had this experience as well, even in the last 6 months, of having correspondence or interactions ignored, ignored and not responded to. And I think there's a way in which institutions are sheltered from direct calling out, and bureaucracy functions to shelter the pseudo social status of higher level administration, you know, that protects people from having to hear directly anything, so that your correspondence can get lost, or it never got to them, or they were busy, or those kinds of things. These are all problems that I think make the kinds of things that Jasmine was talking about a minute ago incredibly admirable, but also incredibly and shamefully necessary. That we have to go to that extent of gathering global and massive response to get a slight change in a policy, or to allow a meeting to take place.
Mm-hmm.
This tells me that there's something really wrong with institutions if they feel so secure in not having to change without that kind of an effort. And so if there's going to be a positive call out, I think we need to call out Jasmine in that group, but we need to, those kinds of responses shouldn't just be the sensational story that comes out in the paper, but should be a public acknowledgement on a repeated basis of the nature of that positive behavior. Mm-hmm. Because I think institutions have long been too protected.
Well, it's also interesting that I'm hearing again the kind of labor that it takes to do the call out, whether that's emotional or otherwise. One doesn't just get thousands of signatures and getting to the media, or just sitting and having the energy to call somebody out when there's a perceived wrong. That's a lot of energy. We're moving toward the sort of final moments here. We didn't say that we were going to resolve things, but we do want to end this with some reflections on how to practice self-reflection before calling out, and perhaps how to practice self-reflection when when we are called out. So any thoughts on that? Those two, since that is one of our principles, we're not necessarily moving to a space of talking about what's compassionate and what's not, and what's respectful and what's not, but we do want to sort of focus on the principle of self-reflection, which everybody can do. So is there any way or any suggestions or strategies on how to practice self-reflection prior to calling someone out? And then how do you practice self-reflection after we are called out? And maybe that's the strategy and the wording there, is to practice those. But any thoughts on that?
Well, for me, I feel like I always ask myself like a set of questions. Mm-hmm. What do we do with? Okay. Like, what do we do with? What do we do for? And how do we support somebody? How do I support somebody through the learning process? And how do I want to be supported through the learning process? There have been so many moments of, call out culture on, online about, when we talk about clothing appropriation and those kind of things that have really helped to see, oh, there's a history behind that. Now let me go learn more about that history, you know, whether it be, you know, the size of your earrings or the way in which you braid your hair or all of these types of things. It's like, oh, there's something that I've learned I didn't know, let me go learn before. And so I hope to be able to emulate that and to model that for the people that I come in contact with.
Mhm. And
I also have a set of questions that I ask, and they're what just happened, and I'm an ethnographer, so I try to outline, to describe what happened to myself in my head. You know, I don't necessarily have to write it down. What just happened? What did I feel? What do I need? What do I want? And then what should I do? And they're broad and open-ended in the sense that the what should I do especially is the one that deals not only with what am I going to do in the calling out, but do I need to go and find support? Do I need to read more? Do I need to learn more? Do I need to reach out? Because depending on what's happened, what we should do might be very wide-ranging. And I think the part that's not so much a question that's investigatory, but is one to establish my support network is who are my friends and who's my support network? Who can I reach out to just to have my back in either way? Because I think that's really, really important, and that can also disrupt that repetitive traumatic-like response that we can have sometimes, which can escalate the way that something has felt, whether we were the ones calling out, because that's usually because we felt violated in some way, or for ourselves or for people that we feel allies with, or you know, for just the other behaviors. But I think establishing a set of questions that would work for you would be really important.
And I think balancing the personal and the like, having, if you're calling out a person versus calling out an institution, I think requires a different set of questions for sure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And can someone sort of distinguish briefly the difference between calling in and calling out? Have you heard that term of calling in?
I've heard the term. To answer your question, I've heard the term. Yes.
Okay, well, we want to give that as an assignment then, as we leave here, is we're talking about calling out, but there's also something called calling in, and there are different strategies that each of those requires of us. But I think part of what you both just talked about is sort of looking at and self-reflecting on why are we responding. And, you know, I made the point in one of our earlier discussions is that when the call out happens, sometimes it's more impulsive and doesn't necessarily allow for time to think through. And so I think we have to acknowledge that on some level too, is that if something has been triggered, it does not mean that you have time to reflect on it in that moment. And one doesn't prepare necessarily something that works all the time for triggering. We may have strategies, but it doesn't mean that. And I've experienced that myself too. Well, we have come to the end of our program. We don't want people to leave because we've got a few wrap-up things, but we have to thank first our Project Humanities team, Jocelyn and Shana.
Thank you so much.
And Rachel and Akalish and Capriol for helping us do this program. This pivot to virtual has been challenging, but what we didn't want to do was cancel our programs. And then I want to thank you both, Dr. De La Garza and Ellie, for spending time with us, and for our participants, those who are still with us, please don't leave. I would say that you could be anywhere, but I want to imagine that you're all someplace self-isolating, but you could certainly tune in to do other stuff than stay with us for an hour and a half. We are still learning. And then I'll invite my other colleagues in to sort of talk about a little bit more about a resource list and then the post survey. So Jocelyn, would you come in, please?
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight. As with all of our events, what will happen in the next few days is if you signed up with an email address to attend this event, I will be sending you out the articles, podcasts, books, etc. And panelists will also have a chance to contribute to that list as well.
Okay.
Also, on that resource email, follow-up email, you will see a link to our website with upcoming events. So please be sure to check that out as well. Thank you.
All right, and then we do have a survey. Rachel, can you talk about the survey? Because we always want feedback, the good, bad, and the unpretty.
The unpretty.
Rachel?
Yes. So again, thank you everyone for staying this long. We would like to ask that we have about 3 more minutes of your time once this webinar is over. We do appreciate getting feedback from every single event. It's important not only when we tackle challenging topics just like this, in investigating, you know, what have we done right and what can we work on, but also we love to get feedback on how this new online platform is working and also, you know, what we've done right and what we can do better. So after this webinar is over, a link will populate on your screen and it will redirect you to a survey on Qualtrics. Please take the time to fill it out. If you are rushed and have to go and do something else, you can certainly come back to it. But we do want that participation for that because it really does help us improve our programs and continue to do the things that we do well.
And then finally, thank you, Rachel and Jocelyn. And then finally, we do want to give some things away for those who have come. We've always tried to look not only for recommendations, but we also have a book that we've discovered in the office. It's by one of the leading diversity and inclusion trainers in the country, who's also an attorney. And people are always asking for, tell me stuff to do, give me something concrete, give me a list. Well, this particular diversity trainer has given us a list here, and it's a book called, Well, What If I Say the Wrong Thing? So she gives us a list of 25 habits for culturally effective people. And we'd like to give out 5 of those books now, and Shana will be choosing those names randomly of those who will receive them in addition to our 2 panelists. Okay, Shana?
Yep. Hi, everyone. So I have went ahead and input all of the attendees' names into a random name picker online. And so the first winner of the book is Megan Todd. Congratulations, Megan. The second name is Vi Lee or V Lee.
Okay.
Congratulations. Winner number 3, Julie Heineking. Winner number 4, Brandy Tooman. And winner number 5, Kareem Neal. Congratulations, you all. I will be emailing you in the coming days to get your email out, well, your mailing address rather, and let you know the status of getting that book mailed out to you. Things are a little complicated now that we're all working from home, but I will keep you in the loop with that process.
Okay, and with that, we thank you all again for coming and staying, and that we hope that we gave you something that you take out that you didn't necessarily come in. So with that, thank you very much. Good evening, and keep up with Project Humanities. We're doing good stuff. Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Peace to everyone.